Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan,
Oh, there's more here.
Okay.
Mr. Tester,
You want me to write on these?
Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville,
I can write on these.
Okay.
But these are,
Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock,
okay. It's all good. You guys know it's good. We'll figure it out.
Gotcha.
Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Durbin, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kelly, Leahy, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, Murphy, Murray, Padilla, Peters, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Sinema, Stabenow, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative. Got you both. Barrasso, Braun, Burr, Capito, Collins, Cotton, Kramer, Daines, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Murkowski, Paul, Romney, Rubio, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Thune, Toomey, Tuberville, and Wicker. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Reed? I did. Aye. Mr. Booker? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? No. I got you. Mr. Hoeven? No. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Marshall, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Hawley, no.
Where are the ones after 3107?
Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye.
As soon as you do 51, can I have it?
51?
Yep. And then I'll
31,
get these
51?
3251. The next one he has.
Got it.
to tag, and then I can.
Marianne, this is 3301. Do you have one that's 3251?
Mr. Bozeman, no.
I don't have the 3251 one.
Oh, here it is. No, that's 33.
Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Lummis, no.
Are you okay for a second?
I'm sorry. Mr. McConnell, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Sullivan, no.
Are you almost back to normal?
Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Johnson, no.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 49, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the resolution.
Calendar number 122, S. Conres 14, setting forth the congressional budget for the United States government for fiscal year 2022 and setting forth the appropriate budgetary levels for fiscal years 2023 through 2031.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that for the duration of the Senate's consideration of S-Con Res 14, the budget resolution for fiscal year 2021, the majority and the Republican managers of the resolution, while seated or standing at the managers' desks, be permitted to deliver floor remarks, retrieve, review, and edit documents, and send email and other data communications from text displayed on wireless personal digital assistant devices and tablet devices. I further ask unanimous consent that the use of calculators be permitted on the floor during consideration of the budget resolution. Further, that the staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the resolution, if necessary, consistent with the amendments adopted during Senate consideration, including calculating the associated change in the net interest function and incorporating the effect of such adopted amendments on the budgetary aggregates for federal revenues, the amount by which the federal revenues should be changed, new budget authority, budget outlays, deficits, public debt, and debt held by the public. Finally, that the following staff members from my staff and from Senator Graham's staff be given all access floor passes for consideration of the resolution. Majority staff, Michael Jones, Joshua Smith, Melissa Kaplan Pistoner, Billy Jindal, and Liam Fagan. Republican staff, Nick Myers, Matthew Giroux, Matthew Joe Keeley, Becky Cole, and Chrisanne Pierce.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that there be 2 minutes for debate equally divided prior to each vote during consideration of S-Con Res 14.
Is there objection? Without objection.
President, let me begin by thanking President Biden and Majority Leader Schumer for their leadership in the arduous process which has gotten us to where we are right now. Mr. President, I do understand that many of my Republican colleagues are in a bit of shock. They're in a bit of shock now. They are finding it hard to believe that the President and the Democratic caucus are prepared to go forward in addressing the long-neglected needs of working families and not just the 1% and wealthy campaign contributors. That's not the way things usually happen around here. Usually it's the big money interests, the campaign contributors, and the lobbyists who call the tunes. But not today. Today, we move this country in a very different direction. Mr. President, the American people are sick and tired of growing income and wealth inequality in our country, where two people now own more wealth than the bottom 40%, where the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 92%, and where 45% of all new income has gone to the top 1% since 2009. In other words, the people on top are doing phenomenally well. Meanwhile, while the very rich have become much richer, the gross unfairness of our current tax system has allowed in a given year some of the wealthiest people in our country and some of the largest and most profitable corporations to not pay a nickel in a given year in federal income tax, not one penny. Well, that is about to change. The American people want a government which represents all of us and not just the few. And this legislation is going to ask the wealthiest people in our country to start paying their fair share of taxes so that we can address the needs of working families, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. And despite what some of my Republican colleagues may be saying, no one in America who makes less than $400,000 a year will pay a nickel more in federal taxes. In fact, what we are looking at in this budget proposal is an historic tax cut for working families and the middle class. Further, and importantly, at a time when California is on fire, when Oregon is on fire, when Greece is burning, and when countries throughout the world are experiencing unprecedented drought, which will clearly impact food production, this legislation begins the process of combating climate change so that our kids and grandchildren can live in a country and a planet which is healthy and habitable. It would be immoral and an absolute dereliction of our responsibilities as elected officials to do anything less. We cannot ignore climate change any longer. Now is the time for our great country to lead the world out of this existential crisis. And by the way, as we address the long-neglected needs of working families and as we combat climate change, we are going to create millions of good-paying jobs, many of them union jobs. Let me very briefly take this opportunity to describe some of what is in this budget proposal. First, we are going to address the disgrace of the United States having the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. This is the wealthiest country on earth, and we should not have millions of our children living in poverty. This budget is going to provide the long-awaited for help that working parents all over this country desperately need. And when we do that, we will substantially reduce childhood poverty in America. And we're going to do that by extending the child tax credit so that families continue to receive monthly direct payments of up to $300 per child. We began that process in the American Rescue Plan. It has been enormously successful in Vermont and all over this country as parents finally get the help that they need to raise their kids. And in fact, it has helped reduce childhood poverty in our country by 61%. And we are going to extend those child tax credits. Further, we're going to help working parents by addressing the crisis in childcare, by making sure that no working family in our country pays more than 7% of their income for childcare. And all over this country, talking to parents in Vermont, elsewhere, people are paying 25% of their income for childcare so that they can go to work. That makes no sense at all. And under our proposal, no working family will pay more than 7%. And when we do that, when we make childcare more affordable and accessible, it will allow over 1 million women who are now home with their kids to re-enter the workforce and improve our economy. And further, in terms of addressing the needs of our working parents and their kids, we will expand public education by providing universal pre-K to every 3- and 4-year-old in the country. Madam President, this budget proposal is going to end the international disgrace of the United States being the only major country on earth not to guarantee paid family and medical leave as a right. Somebody who is sick today should not be forced to go to work and maybe by expanding their illness by contagion, make other people sick. Parents should be able to stay home with their sick children. And when a woman has a baby, she should not be forced back into work a week after giving birth simply because she has no income to stay home. Yes, in America, we will join every other major country and guarantee paid family and medical leave. And Madam President, we will begin to address the crisis in higher education by making community colleges in America tuition-free. And this will give millions of young people and working people the opportunity to get the education they need to acquire the skills so they can go out and get the good-paying jobs that are out there. It will also give people the opportunity to transfer the 2 years of credits earned at a community college to a 4-year school. Now, I hope in years to come we will go further, but 2 years of free community college is no small thing. Madam President, this budget proposal begins the process of taking on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and saving taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars by requiring that Medicare negotiate prescription drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry. It is not acceptable to me and to the American people that we continue to pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Medicare must negotiate prescription drug prices, and this budget sets the stage for that to happen. And Madam President, we will use the savings acquired by negotiating prescription drug prices in Medicare by expanding Medicare. We're going to use those savings to expand Medicare to cover the dental care, the hearing aids, the eyeglasses that seniors desperately need. This is the wealthiest country on earth, and yet we have millions of senior citizens who lack teeth in their mouth. They need dentures, but can't afford to get it. They need hearing aids in order to communicate with their grandkids, can't afford to do that. They need a decent pair of glasses, can't afford that. And in terms of health care, we will also substantially increase the number of doctors, nurses, and dentists who practice in underserved areas and expand the community health center program into new areas as well. Madam President, this budget proposal will combat homelessness in America and address the reality that nearly 18 million households are paying over 50% of their limited incomes for housing through an unprecedented investment in affordable housing. We will ensure further that people in an aging society, we're getting older as a society, and that we will ensure that those people can receive the health care they need in their own homes instead of being forced into expensive and inadequate nursing homes, and that the workers who provide that important care to the elderly and the disabled are not forced to exist on starvation wages. This is such important work and such emotionally draining work. Those folks deserve a decent paycheck. And Madam President, we will bring undocumented people out of the shadows and provide them with a pathway to citizenship, including those very brave workers who have courageously kept our economy going in the middle of a deadly pandemic. Madam President, as I mentioned earlier, we will take on the existential threat of climate change by transforming our energy system toward renewable energy and energy efficiency. Among many other provisions in terms of climate change, we will establish a civilian climate corps which will give hundreds of thousands of young people good-paying jobs and educational benefits as they roll up their sleeves and get to work to help us save the planet. This budget proposal, will make it easier, not harder, for workers to join unions in America. Madam President, my Republican colleagues are upset that we are using the reconciliation process and only 50 votes to pass this budget. They're very upset about that. But let us be clear. This idea of using reconciliation is certainly not a new idea. When Republicans controlled the Senate, they used reconciliation to pass trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1% and large corporations. When Republicans controlled the Senate, they used reconciliation to make climate change worse by opening up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling. When Republicans controlled the Senate, they tried to use reconciliation to repeal the Affordable Care Act and throw 32 million Americans off of the health care they had. Well, today it is true. We will also use reconciliation, but we will do it in a different way. We will use it to help the working families of our country and not just the wealthy and the powerful. Madam President, it is no great secret that millions of Americans are giving up on democracy, are moving toward authoritarianism, and are losing faith in their government. Many of those people are working longer hours for lower wages. They can't afford health care. They can't afford to send their kids to college, and they worry very much about the future of their kids and the future of this country. This legislation will not only provide enormous support, unprecedented in recent American history, to the children in our country, to the parents in our country, to the elderly people in our country, to the working families of our country, but it will also, I hope, restore the faith of the American people in the belief that we can have a government that works for all of us and not just the few. Thank you, Madam President.
Hey, Madam President.
Senator from South Carolina,
Thank you.
good to see you back.
Good to be back. Thank you for the inquiries about my well-being to all my colleagues. I appreciate the good wishes and the phone calls and the food, and I made it. I think the worst is behind me. I want to reinforce a simple message. If you haven't been vaccinated regarding the COVID problem,